The Phoenix area and the state of Arizona are getting invaded. We're not talking about enemy soldiers or a plague. We're talking about a specific kind of business, one that's bringing a lot of jobs and investments and helps us with our digital lives, but threatens to use a whole lot of electricity and water. And this poses some other unique challenges to the future of our economy and our neighborhoods.
Taking you behind the investigation. This is the Arizona's Family Investigates podcast.
Hello and welcome to this edition of the Arizona's Family Investigates podcast, where we're going to talk about the proliferation of data centers. I'm Amy Cutler, and I'm joined by my colleagues Morgan Loew and Cody Lillich. Morgan and Cody, you have been looking at this issue for a while now. What are the problems and challenges involved here?
Well, we looked into this issue along with our national investigative team. They've been taking a hard look at data centers, not only here in Arizona, but across the country, and the impact they've had on communities where they set up shop across the country. So let's start with a look at their story and sort of a scene setter of what we focused on here in Arizona. Here's reporter Josie Sturman.
When Ari Govani Young bought her house about 45 minutes outside D.C., she was looking for an escape.
We had a beautiful view of a field with trees. A lot of nights you'd see different animals walking through, so it was pretty much our little oasis.
A piece of lush paradise in suburban Virginia that has since been transformed into a concrete jungle.
And when you look at it, what do you think about this place?
Oh, it's horrible. It's absolutely atrocious.
A cement shadow rising to the sky just 200 feet from her balcony. What she and other neighbors were originally told would be a retail center with restaurants and shops they could walk to was later zoned for and turned into something they can't even stand.
Unfortunately, our community was the guinea pig. We were the test subject to see, can we build a data center this close to a community? And yes, you can.
Data centers are essentially warehouses filled with computer processors, servers, and equipment. They can be used for cloud computing and storage, the machines that make it possible to hold on to your old email and pictures. Lately, they've also become a hub for artificial intelligence. That's the kind of technology that simulates human learning. Things like using ChatGPT to tell you the meaning of life, write you a love song, or track down scientific studies. These data centers are changing our world and our landscape as companies like Amazon, Google, and Meta invest in AI across America.
Data centers are vital to enabling critical and emerging technologies like AI that are essential to U.S. national security, our global competitiveness, and economic prosperity.
The competition is a power struggle, not just to dominate the AI industry globally, but also to provide the energy needed to physically fuel data centers here at home.
I spoke with Microsoft. The Microsoft data centers, not all, but some Microsoft data centers can use as much power as the city of Seattle.
And it's cities and towns nationwide that are dealing with the consequences and concerns attached to these concrete giants. As massive data centers begin a physical takeover of some communities, there's also unease about the pain customers may feel in their pocketbook when it comes to supporting these facilities from Georgia to Nebraska.
The concern here that data centers could put a drain on much needed resources or can impact power and water bills.
They have multiple data centers and they're seeing skyrocketing electric rates.
That to me should be setting off alarm bells.
It's something Tyson Slocum has been warning about.
Big tech wants to see someone else pick up the tab for all this expensive infrastructure, and utilities are happy to accommodate by building the infrastructure and then billing all consumers within the service territory for that infrastructure.
Slocum, an energy expert with the nonprofit consumer advocacy group Public Citizen, testified to Congress in April about the impacts of the rapid expansion of AI data centers nationwide.
When you're asking working families to pay higher electric rates so that more infrastructure can be built to serve billionaire-controlled tech companies, that's a problem.
Although industry leaders say they're committed to paying the full cost of service for the energy they use, experts dispute that. And many people don't even know the behemoths that could impact their power bill are even being built.
I don't understand why that should be a secret, right? If someone wants to come build something, they should be proud and be willing to come at the very first opportunity in front of your community.
But many people are being kept in the dark about the development of data centers in their backyard, with non-disclosure agreements used as the projects get off the ground. Some companies are requiring local governments to keep the details secret until certain water and power deals are locked, and it's happening across the nation. Our national investigative team sent public information requests to dozens of communities in all 50 states, asking for copies of any NDAs signed as part of data center development. We discovered some extend for years, even if nothing is ever approved, and that both parties have to agree not to share information about the project's location or details. One we obtained from Virginia never even mentions the phrase data center, instead referring vaguely only to development. Another in Indiana covered a project that could span as many as 400 acres. And two NDAs we got from Texas warn that leaks could lead to legal action, with one setting a 5-year confidentiality period. That's long enough for a project to be planned, approved, and potentially built without full public scrutiny.
We've heard directly from folks that very often, under the terms of the NDA, the big tech companies reach a tentative agreement with local officials, and then the local officials say, okay, now we go to the public. But by then it's a done deal. 99% of all of the details have been negotiated in private between big tech's lawyers and the local officials. And by the time you've got a public hearing, the presentation is, here's the deal that's on the table, take it or leave it.
We asked 6 of the nation's biggest data center companies about the use of NDAs and other issues. Only 2 and a national lobbying group responded. The Data Center Coalition, a trade organization, says NDAs protect company-specific information, details they might be hesitant to share given the competition. And Meta told our team that maintaining confidentiality increases the speed and efficiency of projects, pointing out that sometimes they choose not to move forward, so these agreements keep them from pulling communities through the ups and downs of the process. Still, this development can happen under a veil of secrecy, even though the projects may put a substantial strain on individual customers and the nation's power grid as a whole.
The data centers and the load growth associated with that has just put a heightened sense of urgency into a number of things we've been concerned about anyway.
Jim Robb is the president and CEO of the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC. That's the regulatory group in charge of ensuring the security and reliability of our power grid, something that's being tested as more and more data centers come online.
It's a very daunting challenge for the country.
A test of grid reliability that has already exposed serious problems. An April presentation to federal regulators obtained by our team highlights 2 major incidents in Virginia. One of them, a near miss last summer, involves 60 data centers that simultaneously dropped off the grid. As a result, a huge amount of electricity on the grid suddenly had nowhere to go. Experts say it's like having a large nuclear power plant come online immediately and unexpectedly, creating a massive energy imbalance that could have led to blackouts.
The close calls are very concerning. And if they come off the grid in ways that we don't understand, can't predict, and can't manage, they can introduce oscillations in the grid, instability, which can eventually start to impact people's ability to use power in their homes.
Because what this comes down to is if one of these data centers or multiple data centers go offline suddenly, that's going to have a ripple effect that is going to impact Joe consumer that has absolutely nothing to do with the data center.
It absolutely could, right? And that's one of the reasons we want to make sure that they're well understood, well modeled, and well controlled.
Consumer advocates say that's why there should be more regulation and more tools to respond. Until that happens, the data center industry, utilities, and communities all agree there needs to be more study, more collaboration, and more communication.
A lot of the community didn't even know that this was happening because, again, they send out a mailing or they'll post a little sign, little tiny sign at the front that there's a public hearing coming up, and you're going, okay, cool, whatever, I don't know what this is.
Back in what they call Virginia's Data Center Alley, people like Ari Gavani-Young say developers need to do more to break down the walls of secrecy before they start physically building foundations.
What's your message to anyone who hears that there is the potential for a data center to pop up in their community?
Get your community on board, get to the meetings, be a voice, be an advocate for your community. That's all we can do.
So that gives us a pretty good look at the big picture of this issue. Morgan, you worked on a companion piece that we aired here in Arizona on our TV stations alongside the national story. What we find out was happening here with the expansion and surge in data centers.
Yeah, all of those issues that the national team brought up are on the minds of residents, regulators, and the people who run our utilities here in the Phoenix area. But we wanted to focus on one question with our reporting, and that question is, will these data centers, with their huge appetites for electricity, affect the power bills of ordinary residents? We are living in a digital world, from cloud computing to online photo and video storage to video conferencing and AI. All of that information is living in a data center, and the Phoenix area is a hot zone for these hot new businesses.
Item 107 is a general plan amendment to establish policy guidance for data centers.
Last week, the issue took center stage at the Phoenix City Council.
We are concerned about the increasing intensity of impacts that the unchecked expansion of data centers are having on our city and state economy and small business community.
The council was considering whether to regulate where data centers can operate.
These can be the size of a neighborhood. The power demand on these things is severe.
And council members got an earful.
These facilities pose serious threats to our environment, infrastructure, and communities.
Data centers are big, and they use a lot of water and electricity. This single data center at 40th Street and the Loop 202 is 80 acres in size and requires its own electrical substation. There are about 140 of them in the Phoenix area, and dozens more are waiting in the wings.
I think it took everyone by surprise.
Kevin Thompson is the chairman of the Arizona Corporation Commission, which is investigating whether the state has the infrastructure to handle the data center rush.
Data centers are a 24/7 operation. They have to keep the servers cool, and that takes a lot of power, a lot of air conditioning to do so.
Do we have the resources? Do we have the electric capacity, the water capacity to continue to grow this business in Arizona? Is it sustainable?
Not at the moment.
The pressure is on power companies like SRP and APS to come up with the additional electricity. Right now, data centers use about 350 megawatts of APS electricity. The all-time high peak demand for APS was 8,200 megawatts last summer. But if all of the data centers that want to set up shop were able to, APS would need to deliver 19,000 megawatts. Do you have the electric generation capacity and transmission capacity to serve every data center that wants to come to the valley right now?
So we have made commitments to a certain amount of that energy to serve, but we do not have the energy and transmission infrastructure to support the amount of energy that's being requested of us.
Patrick Bogle is the data center strategy director at APS. He says it's going to take years to meet the demand, and APS is currently turning away data center customers. What's to stop APS or any other power company from saying, okay, well, we're gonna supply electricity to these high-paying customers, and maybe the service to mom and pop isn't gonna be as good?
Yeah, so ultimate goal for APS is reliability and affordability for our existing customers. We've been able to tell data center customers, we can serve you, but just not now.
The Phoenix City Council passed its new data center regulation with support from many of the data center groups.
This is not saying we don't want a ban. We want to ban data centers in our community. We want to just be more intentional about where they go and make sure that they are not providing a greater risk to the adjacent properties that are next to them.
There is still lots of opposition to the facilities from community groups. It's a message Kevin Thompson at the Corporation Commission understands, but doesn't necessarily agree with. What's the difference between what you're investigating and what these critics of data centers would probably like to see you investigate?
I'm strictly looking at the power side of things, the energy use. How can we ensure that the data centers, are paying their fair share, paying their own way?
Thompson says the data centers need to pay for any infrastructure upgrades required to get them the additional power they'll need. Do you think that the utilities and the data centers are going to be amenable to that idea?
I don't think they have a choice.
So that is a lot to digest. Let's break it down. Morgan, can you explain why a power company adding new capacity would impact residential power bills? It seems like they're in the business of selling power. You would think this is a good thing.
Yeah, and that is what I asked the people at APS. Look, you sell electricity. These are customers that want to come in and buy a lot of electricity. It seems like a win-win for everybody. But the way the electric market and the electric utilities are regulated is totally different from what we would consider, a normal buying and selling, because you can't just create immediate new electric sources. You just can't create electricity out of thin air. It needs to be processed. It needs to be purchased and transmitted. So what we have here is a situation where the electric utilities here in Arizona are pretty much selling all of the electricity that they can create and that they can buy. So what that creates is a situation where they need to build new infrastructure. And the way the electric market is set up, when an electric company builds new infrastructure, it charges all of its customers for that infrastructure, for that generation capacity. And what the fear is here is that these data centers are coming in and they have to create so much more capacity for them that residents at home are going to get charged for the money that these companies are spending on just servicing those data centers. And so that's the fear. And that's what I kept getting at with the regulator from the Corporation Commission and from the utilities is, now are you going to sort of change the way you've done business and you're going to build this capacity? It's going to go to these centers, so they're the ones that are going to pay for it. And they say the answer is yes.
So from what we heard in your story, the chairman of the Corporation Commission is vowing to prevent power companies from charging residential customers for the infrastructure improvements they need to accommodate data centers. How does the Corporation Commission have that authority?
So that's the unique setup that we have here in Arizona. The Corporation Commission is the independently elected body, and their job is to oversee corporations, it's in their name, but also utilities here in the state of Arizona. They also approve any rate increases that may come up or may be planned further down the road and asked for by the power companies that are in the state. They also have the authority to regulate these companies and add requirements for power companies that do business here. So that's essentially their job in a nutshell. And the chairman, Kevin Thompson, directed his staff to open a docket or an investigation about these data centers that are just flooding into the valley and the state of Arizona. He opened this investigation into how all of these new electricity, this demand for electricity, could affect the grid here in Arizona and the customers and residential customers. Other governing bodies have also been looking into ways to regulate data centers here in the valley and across the state. The city of Mesa just voted on regulating where the data centers can go and what areas of the city it can be in. And as we reported in Morgan's story, the city of Phoenix, the city council voted to regulate where they can set up shop just within the last week. Here's some of that meeting that they talked about these concerns, and residents showed up in force to talk about their concerns with these data centers, basically moving in some cases, in their own backyards.
Item 107 is a general plan amendment to establish policy guidance for data centers.
These impacts are significant and include the stability of the electrical grid. Analysis has shown that large data centers can use anywhere from 100,000 to 1 million gallons of water a day, or the equivalent of 8,000 homes. With the addition of this language, it would provide guidance on where they would be permitted, which districts they're allowed in, and what the standards they would need to develop under.
These can be the size of a neighborhood. The power demand on these things is severe. The water demand on these things is severe. For the fire response and the emergency responders that come to these facilities, what they're going to find is a maze. We have had fires at these facilities across the country. We've had these fires at these things across the globe. Once these things get beyond the initial phase of a fire, we don't have a lot of success getting the fire under control. When a fire gets outside of the box of a data center, you've got real problems with the kind of chemicals and dioxins that will pour on the community around you.
A fire in a data center can easily overwhelm built-in suppression systems, which would necessitate the fire department using tremendous amounts of water, which would create contaminated runoff. Data centers pose a risk to firefighters as well as the community at large. The best way to fix an emergency is to avoid it happening in the first place.
Yeah, there are some real public safety concerns.
I was watching this meeting. I wasn't at the meeting, but I was watching the live feed, and I was surprised at the number of firefighters who spoke out during the meeting. They do view these as businesses that could create a real danger for first responders if there's an emergency on site. And there are a few reasons for this. One of them is just the sheer size of these buildings. The one that we pointed out in our story is 80 plus acres, these huge buildings on that site. You're a firefighter getting sent somewhere for a fire, some kind of an emergency. I mean, there's the response time is 4 or 5 minutes. That means you have 4 or 5 minutes to figure out where you're going and what you're going to be going into. Oftentimes, firefighters just have that amount of time to get prepped by dispatch who are looking up what this business is, and this is what you're going into. So the sheer size is a challenge, and where in the building is that fire? But also the chemicals. Computers are awesome. We use them all the time, but they're made of some toxic materials, and they catch on fire. That smoke isn't like wood burning in a house fire. This is some real toxic stuff. And they oftentimes also have sort of battery systems on site, and that can create some additional new challenges Cody's been looking into as well.
Yeah, this is a whole new world for firefighters to deal with as they respond to these emergencies as they pop up at these centers and storage facilities that emerge. Because essentially when we hear about cloud computing and data centers, essentially what it is inside that building is just row after row. I mean, it's basically you think of your company's IT office and server room. It's that on steroids, basically. So it's just row after row of racks of computers that build up these data centers, usually not staffed by anybody, and they run 24/7. So the demand is huge. The energy they use and the chemicals that are stored inside is something that firefighters don't deal with, responding to the day-to-day house fire, car crash, things like that. So this is a whole new world for them that they've had to deal with over the past several years. And they've also had to deal with things as common as, because lithium-ion batteries are a concern not only in these facilities but also in everyday appliances. So they've had to specialize their training in that, but they're also having to specialize their training in these data centers and these battery energy storage facilities that store all this power, because that's another area that is actually on the rise here in Arizona. Is APS and SRP and other power entities are looking at ways that if we have some surplus power, how can we store that for the future? So that also creates another concern for firefighters and first responders, that you don't know what kind of energy is stored in there. And no matter what kind of lithium ion fire is burning, it has to essentially just burn itself out because of the cell nature of the makeup of these batteries and the celled nature of the storage at these data centers. Basically, once it starts burning, it has to burn itself out. And we've seen instances at data centers and at storage facilities where they have had to burn for quite a long time.
Yeah, if you've ever seen a fire department respond to a electric vehicle that's on fire, I mean, they just put water on it and put water on it, and it just goes and goes and goes because these batteries have so much energy and they burn so hot. It's really hard to put those fires out. But imagine being a firefighter and showing up at this building that's, as large as any warehouse that you've seen out there, and the power's off, or you don't know where you're going. You go in there, and it's just these rows and rows of computer racks. You're trying to figure out what's on fire. It's just a real challenge for firefighters. So they say that just the fact that the city of Phoenix came up with these regulations was a good thing for them, because now they'll know where the data centers are located. There'll be some areas where they're not allowed to go in. The data center industry, for the most part, agreed with those regulations and was on board, saying, okay, we're all for having some regulations, so we know that where we're going to put our facilities in is accepted by the community. They want the first responders to be able to do their job. The first responders want to make sure that if they're going to X facility, they know what's on site, what chemicals are on site, what's being stored. And it's even possible to get like a diagram of what it looks like. And so this new regulation that's coming in is designed to protect the communities, the neighborhoods, and the first responders. And this is really sort of a whole different topic that Cody and I are talking about now. And it's something that we as an investigative team are starting to look into. And we're going to have more information on sort of the public safety part of it, as opposed to just the economic part of it, and is this going to affect my pocketbook part of it?
Tell me too, since you've both been looking into that, or into this rather, is Phoenix sort of at the forefront in creating regulation on this? Is this something that other cities might, or valley cities might consider implementing as well moving forward?
When it comes to here locally, it seems that this kind of ordinance has the cities have work together, if not indirectly or directly, to kind of make sure that these ordinances are uniform, because you don't really want to end up where, one city doesn't have regulation, one city does. So a lot of the cities have these regulations kind of mirror one another. So whether the cities, worked on it directly, or whether they had indirect coordination, these ordinances are kind of lining up to be the same framework, at least here in the Valley. As far as the rest of the country, it's kind of a patchwork of, where is regulated, where is not, and what extent these regulations go to. And I think that was a big concern for the cities here, is that they wanted regulation, but they didn't want too much regulation to draw these companies away, because this is a big draw for that they can see coming to Phoenix and the Valley here in Arizona.
Yeah. Virginia, I think, is the hot spot for data centers. Dallas is also big. And then I think Phoenix is either 2 or 3 on that list. The people at the city of Phoenix who came up with our regulations looked at other regulations across the country. And I've heard this phrase, I can't remember who to directly attribute it to, whether it was the Corporation Commission or somebody from the city of Phoenix. But they said, look, we want to come up with regulations on this. We don't want to be the first one to come up with regulations. We want to see what other people are doing and pick the best and make sure that our regulation works and it is done the right way. I thought that was kind of interesting, because oftentimes you see, well, we need to regulate this right away. And there is I think some benefit to seeing what's happening other places, what's too much, what's not enough, and then come up with your own plan. I think that at the city of Phoenix, they think that their plan is sort of the best of everything that's out there right now.
To counter that real quick, you also kind of have it, if you look at this from the 30,000-foot view of, there are already established data centers that have set up, and now the regulation exists. And so essentially they are grandfathered in.
Yeah.
So, it's kind of too little too late for those, but it's looking to the future and the dozens that have pending applications.
Yeah. Yeah, because a lot more want to set up shop here.
Yeah, speaking of that specifically, it seems like there are a lot of companies that want to come to Phoenix. What is it about Phoenix that makes it such an attractive market for data centers?
When we started looking into this story, I just figured it was the same reason the TSMC and Intel were here. We have a very stable sort of environment, like a climate here. Yeah, it gets hot in the summer. We don't have earthquakes. We don't have hurricanes. So if you're going to build a huge facility, this is a good place to do it. We also have Arizona State University, U of A, and NAU, and a bunch of other schools and universities here, which means that we have a pretty educated workforce. The land here is still fairly inexpensive when compared to other parts of the country. So I figured that those were the three keys. But what I learned as we looked into this was that the real draw for these companies was a tax incentive that was signed into law in 2013 that allows data centers to come in and write off the physical computer equipment that they put in. And as you can imagine, these data centers are 24/7 operations. There is a lot of turnover with equipment. So if they're able to get a tax incentive every time they have to reinvest in that equipment, that becomes a huge savings for them. And so that tax incentive is still in effect. It was a state law that was passed. And that's one of the real reasons they're coming here. And as it is turning out, it's also a double-edged sword, because written into that law is a provision that says that these data centers can get that tax incentive so long as they don't produce their own electricity on site and put it back into the grid. And I'm not sure why that provision was put in. I don't know if it was at the behest of the power companies that didn't want to compete with a data center that was putting electricity back in the grid. That may not have been the case, but it was put in there. And what that has done now is it has prevented these data centers from creating some of their own electricity, which would help offset the big draw that's coming from the grid. And so I asked Kevin Thompson at the Corporation Commission, are we looking at taking a second look at that law and maybe taking that part of it out of the law so that this giant, data center in the middle of town could put solar panels on the roof and then offset some of the impact they're having on the grid? And he said they're probably not looking at updating the law. There's a concern that the legislature that's in office now would take away the incentive completely, and we would lose this new high-tech business that is coming and that is bringing jobs and it is bringing investment to the community. And so they're worried that if they took a second look at it, it would go away altogether. And that's kind of a pretty common thing when you look at laws. Oftentimes, special interests, legislators, experts are loath to go back in and reopen Pandora's box because you never know how it's going to get changed. So they're looking at the law as it is now and figuring out how to work around it and how to try to help the electric companies, SRP and APS here in the Phoenix area, to best come up with more electricity on a responsible way that they can increase the number of these data centers, but do it, not at the detriment of, Joe and Sally Phoenix, who are living on a fixed income and hoping that their electric bill isn't going to go up. I had no idea about that law before I started looking into this.
Tell me too, you wonder how residents who are now living next to these massive data centers feel about this development, because there were some pretty nice apartment buildings that were put up near some of these data centers. I wonder, during the city council meeting, was there some neighbor reaction to things? And if so, what'd they have to say?
Yeah.
Yeah, there were a lot of reactions, as we heard in the clip, and some that was with the firefighters, but also, there were residents as well that were showing up concerned about what this is bringing to their neighborhoods. I believe the city council ordinance actually had to go to each neighborhood association and get a majority of those before it was even brought before the council. So this had a lot of input from a lot of different neighborhoods and communities across Phoenix and the other cities as well, because residents are concerned. What is it bringing to their area? What is it putting in their backyard? What kind of power draw is it going to have? And, as you said, is it going to raise my power bill at all? And, what environmental impacts do we have to watch out for as well if something were to happen?
Yeah, and as you correctly stated, there are a couple of these up in areas where people are spending a lot of money on apartments and condos for maybe a view of Camelback Mountain or Piestewa Peak, and now they have this data center next door. And so just from the aesthetic perspective, a lot of people spoke out saying, let's try to keep them out of residential areas or out of areas where there are people living. A lot of people spoke out in the Levine area, worried that data centers were going to go in that area where they're trying to create, more neighborhoods and more of like an urban center of, shops and restaurants and that kind of thing. And they're concerned that it's going to become more of a haven for these giant, buildings that are, that have this, these chemicals in them, these machines in them, that they're worried, as we heard from the firefighters, what could happen to the neighboring communities if there's an emergency there. But also, you put in an 80-acre data center, you're not having an 80-acre baseball field, or you're not having an 80-acre urban center where people can go shopping and go, to a restaurant or go see a movie. So it's, that was also one of the driving reasons why the Phoenix City Council voted for this, because it gives them more of a control over where these things can go and put more of a plan together instead of just a mishmash of they're going here because they could get the land. Now it's, okay, they can get the land, but is this the right area that they should go?
And that was the issue with citizens in Levine who basically, they knew that their area is growing and wanted, suburban life, but also it's probably one of the most rural parts of Phoenix, the city itself. So, wanting to actually keep that rural life while actually, still growing with the rest of the city and embracing the suburbanness that is growing out in that way, but not the urbanization that would be created if, a data center did come in instead of a baseball field or instead of a strip mall that would, add in stores.
Yeah, I think it's one of the growing phenomena of the Phoenix area and even between here and Tucson is you drive along the freeway, you drive along the road, and you see these fields that are growing alfalfa or corn or whatever they're growing out there. And then you see these absolutely humongous warehouses set up out there. And there is a sense in rural Arizona and on the exterior where you have the urban and suburban and rural all sort of connect, that they moved out there to live near a field, near horses and cattle that are out there. And now they're just getting invaded by these giant buildings, whether they're warehouses or data centers. We are seeing and hearing a little bit of pushback from the community.
I just thought it was fascinating. I went to that city council meeting on another story, and I asked about public comments for red light cameras. No one was signed up to speak. But on data centers, there were tons of people signed up. That was the big issue of the meeting.
And normally red light cameras get everybody out there to talk, but it tells you how big of an issue this is when this eclipses red light cameras.
Yeah, a really important sort of contentious issue in a lot of communities. Morgan and Cody, thank you so much for the insight that we've gained looking into this issue. This is something we're going to continue to follow on air and online. But that's it for now. Thanks for joining us for this edition of the Arizona's Family Investigates podcast.
The Arizona's Family Investigates podcast, hosted by Amy Cutler and produced by Cody Lillich, and a production of Arizona's Family 3 TV, CBS 5, and azfamily.com in Phoenix, Arizona.